The snow had a way of swallowing sound, of muffling hoofbeats until the world felt emptied of everything but breath and heartbeat. He rode with his collar pulled high, his hat bent against the flakes drifting down in slow, relentless sheet. 30 winters had weathered him into something spare and quiet, a man pared down like a fence post left long in the wind. He did not expect change anymore. The land had a way of teaching men not to. That morning, though, he saw a shape that should not have been there. At first it was nothing but a dark blur in the whiteness, half buried where the drifted banks met the frozen line of brush. His horse tossed its head and snorted steam, uneasy, but the cowboy pulled the reins and swung down, boots sinking deep in the powder. What he found made the cold bite deeper than it ever had. A young woman lay curled against the ground, her skin pale as if carved from the snow itself. Her dress, torn and muddied, clung to her like ice cloth. One arm was bent awkwardly, wrist purpled from injury, her breathing shallow, near broken. Against her chest, bound in scraps of cloth, a newborn pressed its face, mewling so softly it sounded more spirit than flesh. The cowboy crouched low. For a moment he could only stare, the snow gathering in her lashes, her lips trembling though her eyes remained shut. He touched her shoulder, gentle as if afraid she might crumble beneath his hand. The child whimpered, and the sound seemed to pierce through all the years he had built walls around himself. 1,000 thoughts flickered. How far had she crawled? What man had left her to the storm? Why Providence would set this burden at his feet? But none of them mattered more than the fact that she was alive, and the baby too, though barely. His own pulse hammered heavy in his ears. "You hold on," he murmured, though he did not expect her to hear. His voice was raw from disuse, strange even to himself. With slow care he lifted them both, the baby first, wrapping it into the fold of his long coat where its faint heat pulsed against him, then the mother, light as a bundle of reeds, her head lolling against his chest. His horse shied under the weight when he swung her across the saddle, but he steadied the animal with a hand, whispering calm until the beast stilled. The trail back to his cabin stretched long, an hour at least, maybe more in the storm. The wind cut at his face, froze the wet in his beard, but he leaned forward, urging the horse onward, guarding the fragile lives pressed against him. Every so often he felt the baby stir against his ribs, heard its thin cry. It steadied him, drove him harder through the white wasteland. Memory haunted him as he rode, an older brother lost in a blizzard years ago, a family dream buried under frost, the silence of seasons spent alone. Yet this was different. Here was a woman fighting breath by breath, a child who had not yet seen the dawn of the world. Their survival clung to him now, and in that weight he felt something long missing stir like a coal under ash. By the time his cabin came into view, a squat shape of logs half buried in snowdrifts, his arms ached, his legs numb. He slid down, lifting mother and child once more, and shouldered the door open against the wind. Warmth met them at last, the embers he had banked earlier still alive in the hearth. He laid them on his bed, stripped away the icy wrappings from the baby, and set about coaxing life back into them both. The child cried in earnest now, a frail sound but steady. He wrapped it tight in wool and held it close, rocking awkwardly, a man unused to such fragile weight. The mother did not wake, though her chest rose with shallow rhythm. He checked her limbs, saw the bruising, the cuts at her temple, the way frost clung to her fingers. She had walked through hell to make it this far. Through the long hours of that evening, he worked as if he had always known how. He fed the fire, rubbed warmth into her hands, pressed water to her lips. Between each task he held the baby close, listening to its small cries echo against the rafters. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside he kept watch, a sentinel against both cold and death. When at last the baby quieted and the mother's breath steadied, he sat back, weary but alert. The flicker of firelight caught the line of her face, sharp yet soft, a youth not yet gone. She could not have seen more than 23 winters. He wondered what road had led her here, What cruel fortune had abandoned her to the snow? For a moment he simply listened, to the crackle of fire, to the faint sigh of the sleeping infant, to the stubborn rhythm of the woman's breath. His cabin had known only silence for so long that these sounds felt foreign, as though life itself had returned after years of exile. He leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving them. Something within him shifted, quiet, deep, unspoken. He did not name it, could not yet, but he felt the truth of it settle. The course of his days had changed. Whatever paths had led him here, they had brought more than strangers to his hearth. They had brought a turning of fate. As the snow fell heavier outside, erasing every track that led to his door, the cowboy sat in watch. He did not know who might come searching, nor what storms lay ahead. He only knew that he had been given 2 fragile lives, and he could not let them slip away. By midnight the fire burned bright, the baby slept in peace, and the woman's hand twitched faintly against the blanket, as if grasping for something unseen. He reached out and let her fingers curl around his own. They were cold still, but the grip was real. That was enough. The storm could rage, the world could turn cruel, but inside that cabin a fragile beginning had been laid. And as he sat there, weary but steadfast, the cowboy understood what he had not in years. His life was no longer his alone. The night did not slow as an old him yet, and when dawn came pale through the shutters, leaving a pale he was still at his post by the bed. The days unfolded with a rhythm that almost felt like a flutter beneath the blanket. Him at the wood lashes trembling mending clothes by the hearth. The baby's for a moment she looked stitching the hours as together. Though she had woken in a place he never said she did not recognize, but the silences between them were no longer heavy. Then the cry of her child broke through the air, and she turned her head from another place, panic flashing in her eyes until she saw the baby swaddled safe near the fire. His heart tightening, her lips something both foreign and familiar. She had learned the shape of his kindness placed it in her smallest gestures, and at once her body the way he offered her the shoulders sagging to the fire without thought and exhaustion. The way he rose in the night when the baby stirred, whimpering, though exhaustion, and she tried to guide it, though her hands shook too much to manage. He had learned her quiet strength. He looked away, she pushed through giving her privacy, to rock her child, yet remained close enough to steady her when the tremors overcame her strength. She whispered a thank you passed between them, voice hoarse as though they were no longer strangers. He only nodded. She told him more of her voice to reply. She spoke the hours of that morning were filled with careful tasks, fixed on the slow and deliberate. The man she had followed west had been charming at first, feeding drops to the child when its mother's body could not yet provide. But when the weight of a new life he brewed a bitter tea of dried willow and roots, he had shown what lay beneath, pressing the cup to her lips, though she winced a heart too shallow for devotion. Between sips she watched him with wary eyes, not to leave her in her as if measuring what sort of man he was. Leaving her body broken from childbirth, her words halting yet steady. She had come west with a man who promised her shelter for a time it was her fault, secure. That she had been promises crack in the weight of reality, that no man could bear such weight. When the baby came he could not bear the burden. Did not offer hollow with nothing but the storm. Listened. Her body when she fell from childbirth, the baby sighed in her arms, nearly gone, and she pressed her lips until her legs collapsed, as if drawing strength. And that was all she remembered before tethered her still to the world. Her voice caught when at last he spoke. It was only pressing down on each word, not weakness. Courage. He listened without judgment. His words landed like stones carrying more comfort than any quick assurance might have. For the first time, she let herself believe them. The thinness of that followed carried a quiet peace. Yet in her story he saw not weakness but a will to snow itself that had carried her through the snow with her newborn. She noticed it in his manner. How his eyes lingered longer on the ridgeline except for the soft crackle of the fire. How his hand rested near the rifle. He busied himself mending her torn sleeve. He said nothing, but she felt it too. His calloused fingers. The past rarely stayed. She watched him work. The first sign came at dusk he gave to such small things. When smoke rose in the distance, days passed in that rhythm, but another. The storm she stiffened at the sight, still clutching the baby close. She regained strength, placed a steady hand on her shoulder, able to sit by the hearth with her child, though his gaze never left that filled the cabin with something warmer. They both knew it was not the widow. He would chop wood or tend the animals. The next day brought riders, yet always returned to find them safe. Their horses stamping the sound of the lullaby, their voices loud and careless as they neared the cabin. She tried often to speak her gratitude. She froze when she heard one laugh. She cut it short with a shake of his head. She knew that laugh. To him it was no act of charity, no burden. The man she had followed simply west, what needed to be done. The man who had abandoned her, yet the way he gave her the larger share not alone, bread, but with kin, or stayed awake they hailed the long watches of demanding the night to soothe the baby. The cowboy told her more than words ever could. The door closing softly a neighbor came once, an older widow herself who lived a mile down the valley, clutching her child, herbs and a jar of broth. The voices carried, sharp with wisdom, biting, lingered on the side of the woman was his bed, spoke of her as though she were nothing but a possession gone astray. Only remarked that Providence placed strange duties on men's shoulders, that she had no right to take it. Left with a look that seemed to know more than it spoke. Urging him on, the young mother at first, thick with threat, to think of what the cowboy's reply was quiet, but the cowboy's calm presence steadied to hear it. He seemed unconcerned only that the woman and child were safe long lived outside that they would not be taken against their will. That unconcern became a shelter for her, just steady words where she could begin to breathe without fear of ridicule. Anger rose in their laughter. There were moments of quiet intimacy. Accused him of stealing another man's family. One evening she tried to rise they would return with more if need be, but her legs failed. Boots crunched, caught her before she fell. And then the sound she leaned against the distance, her head near his shoulder. That followed was heavier than before, clinging to him. That night her heart did not fast. Not she from weakness, by the cradle, from something watching unnamed. Her baby's chest she pulled rise away quickly, her heart flushed, thundering. But the memory he moved about the cabin, checking the shutters, the baby placing the rifle within reach, and he took her in his arms. Set. Pacing she the felt a swell of guilt mother watched that her broken past had brought danger. His large to his hands cradled the infant. She whispered into the firelight, yet the child quieted, staring up at him as though recognizing a guardian. She saw then the look in his eyes hidden beneath his weathered exterior. "You're not alone in this," something deep within her chest. And there was no room for argument blended into one another. Something in her broke by the ticking of clocks, not in despair, by the baby's cries, but in release. The splitting of firewood, she had borne everything alone, voices carried shame and fear like stones in her pockets. She began to see him not only as the man who had saved her, but as one whose solitude had carved a different kind of strength. It was salvation, a patience that did not followed were taught with waiting. He began to see her not as a calm precision, but as someone who had endured more than many men. Splitting logs, her resilience water, shining through each fragile step, carried an air of preparation, as though he was bracing himself for the storm. She could walk the cabin's length. She tried to help where she could. Her child, sewing nestled against her chest, was left into swaddling brighter, though still keeping the hearth blazing. She stood at the window often, gazing out at the snowfields, when fear rose sharp that she should not stay too long. She would catch sight of his life was not meant to be disrupted. Rocking it with an awkward tenderness, he turned from the fire. His rough hands cradling its small body, as though it were something simple. In those moments, until you are strong, he said, and something stronger took root. Nothing less. On the third there was night, no claim in the wind howled, no demand, and the snow drifted only a steady against the cabin that gave her more comfort. She finally asked him the question that had been the first time since she had been left to the cold. Why risk yourself safe enough to believe in tomorrow? That night, was slow to settle the baby staring into the fire, and lay down herself. At last he said, the thought because once, heavy in long her chest, ago, someone I loved was left in the cold, yet treated her with a dignity she had never known. His voice was steady. She did not yet know what that would mean for her future, old loss, but she felt the truth carried silently. Her life had shifted on its axis. Her throat tightened, just as his had. But she did not press further. The fire burned low. Instead, she reached across the small distance, and in the hush between them, she felt the beginning of something unnamed take root. It was a small gesture, spring grass beneath the thaw. Yet in it lay all the not yet love, understanding, not yet spoken voice, but it was enough to carry her into dreams. The baby stirred her heart, a soft whimper, and he lifted it into his arms, the storms cradling it as though it belonged inside there. 3 lives rested beneath the same roof, her heart caught not by blood or of the coming storm, but by the quiet mercy of fragile hope that perhaps, and though none of them spoke it aloud, she had found something more reckoning lay ahead. Outside, for the world did not often allow peace, but they both knew it was only the pause before the breaking. The riders would return, and the peace they had built within these log walls would be tested. She did not yet know how it would end. But as she watched him hold her child, the firelight drawing warmth into his weathered face, she felt a certainty stronger than fear. Whatever storm came, he would not let her face it alone. And that knowledge, fragile as it was, carried her into the darkness of night with her heart steadier than it had been in years. The snow lay deep, muffling every sound, but the stillness was not peace. It was the waiting hush before a storm breaks. She felt it in the air as she cradled her baby, her ears tuned to every creak of the timbers, every crunch of boot outside. He felt it too, his movements steady, deliberate, but his eyes sharper than ever, his hand never far from the rifle resting against the wall. When the riders came again, they came with more. Hooves pounded against the frozen earth, voices sharp, carrying across the valley like knives. She held her child close, rocking it with trembling arms, while he stepped to the door and unbarred it, his shoulders filling the frame as he stood between them and the fragile lives behind him. The man who had abandoned her dismounted first, swaggering as though the land itself belonged to him. His kin flanked him, hard-eyed, their mouths curved with cruel certainty. They called out demands, their words thick with claim. The woman was his, the child his blood, and no backwoods drifter had the right to keep them from him. The cowboy did not raise his voice. He simply said that she would not be taken against her will, that the child was safe here, and no man would call her property while he still drew breath. The words hung in the frozen air, quiet but unyielding, and for a heartbeat even the horses stilled. Laughter broke the silence, bitter and sharp. They mocked him for a fool, called him a thief, swore they would drag her from the cabin whether he stood in the way or not. The abandoned man's eyes gleamed with cruelty, a coward's fury now that others lent him courage. She clutched the baby tighter, pressing its head against her breast, her heart hammering so loud she thought they must all hear it. Through the crack of the door she could see the tension in the cowboy's frame, the stillness before action. He did not bluster, did not threaten. He simply stood as if the mountain itself had risen between her and the men outside. The first moved forward, hand on the butt of his pistol. In that instant the valley held its breath. A hawk cried overhead, the only witness to what would unfold. The cowboy's voice cut through, low and steady. One more step, and you'll find out how fast a quiet man can be. The rider halted, uncertain. They had expected rage, a rush of violence, not this measured calm that felt heavier than steel. For a moment the power shifted, the silence of his resolve pressing against their bluster. But pride is a dangerous thing. The abandoned man spat into the snow and shouted for his kin to take her. Boots shifted, hands twitched toward weapons. The air crackled with the nearness of violence. Then it broke. A pistol lifted, a shot cracked the silence, splintering wood near the doorframe. The baby wailed, her cry piercing the chaos. She fell to her knees inside, shielding the child, while the cowboy stepped into the open, rifle raised. He did not waste bullets. Each shot was chosen, measured, a warning and a promise. Snow kicked up around the riders, horses reared, men cursed. He did not shout, only advanced step by step, his presence more fearsome than rage could ever be. The fight was brief, more standoff than bloodshed. The riders, unprepared for his resolve, faltered beneath the cold truth of a man who had nothing to lose but everything to protect. One fell from his saddle, not dead but wounded, crying out for aid. The others pulled him back, their bravado crumbling as fear took root. The abandoned man lingered last, his face twisted with fury. He shouted that she would regret this, that she had chosen ruin over salvation. But his words rang hollow against the steady click of the rifle chambering another round. At last he mounted and fled with the others, their figures vanishing into the white horizon, swallowed by the storm. Silence returned, heavy and complete. Only the baby's sobs filled the cabin as she rocked the child, her body shaking with fear and relief. He lowered the rifle, his breath visible in the cold air, and turned back toward the doorway. For a moment he simply stood there, the weight of what had passed settling into his bones. When he entered, she rose unsteadily, meeting his eyes. No words came at first. What language could carry such gratitude, such relief, such awe? Instead she reached out, placing her free hand against his chest where his heartbeat thundered beneath. His own hand covered hers, rough and warm, steadying her. At last she whispered, "You stood for us." He shook his head gently. "No. I stood with you." The difference mattered, and she felt it sink deep into her heart. The baby quieted between them, small face soft in the firelight. For the first time since the day she had been left in the snow, she let herself believe in safety. And in the space between their hands, something unspoken bloomed, not yet love declared, but the raw beginning of it, fragile as dawn yet certain as the sun. That night, the cabin was different. The storm outside no longer felt like an enemy but a wall of protection, sealing them together in warmth. He sat with the baby in his arms, rocking her gently while the mother rested, her eyes watching him with a softness she did not try to hide. He told her then, haltingly, of the loss he had carried, of a family he had once dreamed of a brother lost to winter's cruelty, of years spent alone because he thought his heart could no longer bear hope. She listened, tears glinting in her eyes, not out of pity but of recognition. For she too had known what it was to believe life had ended, only to find a new beginning in the ashes. When he finished, the silence that followed was not empty but full, rich with understanding. She reached for his hand again, and he did not let go. The fire burned low, the baby slept, and the snow fell softer against the window. In that stillness, the truth settled quietly between them. Their lives had changed, not by grand design but by mercy, by choice, by the simple act of refusing to let another soul slip into the cold. And to the old heart of the cowboy, hardened by loss, came a truth he had not believed he would know again, that sometimes the family a man is given is not the one he expects, but the one Providence lays before him in the snow. So the story closed its circle, not with triumph shouted, but with love whispered into the hush of winter, a promise as enduring as the mountains that stood watch over them. And though storms would come again, they would not face them alone.